And it's a thrill for me to be here today for a number of reasons, but when I walked into this room this morning, I could just feel the energy and the excitement, and that's kind of energized me a bit, more than a bit actually. Thanks to all the EAA team that has facilitated this and invited me here. I got to spend the day yesterday at the research facility that Paul has been describing, and it's really amazing what's been happening and what the EAA has been accomplishing. And so anyway, gratitude to the EAA for a number of things and also for supporting some of our work in the past, and hopefully we can continue that collaboration. So today is really going to be a description of my own personal journey in terms of really trying to understand the ecohydrology of the Edwards Plateau, and it's really been quite a journey, and the evolution of my thinking has definitely changed. But having said that, I am here today with utmost humility because I've learned many, many times that my working model may not be exactly right. So I'm actually open to refining the model that I'm going to present with you today. So anyway, with that, I want to really couch my talk. So I'm really part ecologist and part hydrologist, and I want to couch my talk in really trying to understand what's happening in terms of a global phenomena. Matt talked about global change, but one really important change that's happened across rangelands is what we call woody plant encroachment. And so about 150 years ago here in Texas, there was this huge, and Matt alluded to this, change, really exploitation of this landscape that has set in motion changes that we are still experiencing today and still reverberating today. So anyway, so my talk is really going to be, in order to understand how I think the ecohydrology of this landscape works and how it's changed, we really need to understand how the Edwards Plateau has changed. Also, just to kind of give you a little bit of background and perspective about my own interest, for whatever reasons, I just love rangelands. And I especially have developed an interest in trying to understand the ecohydrology of savanna systems and woodlands, basically try to measure some of the things that Michael described in terms of the water budget, but have worked in a lot of places, both here in Texas, most of the rangeland ecoregions in Texas, the cross timbers, post oak savanna, South Texas shrublands, the rolling plains. Also have worked in woodlands in other places, the Caatinga shrublands in Brazil, for example, Sonora, the rangelands in Sonora, Mexico. Notice there's really a lot of similarity in terms of these different landscapes. So what I try to do is understand the water cycle in these landscapes, but also it's interesting to try to understand how they are similar and how they're different. But I have a special place in my heart, and I know that most of you here do here as well, in terms of the Edwards Plateau ecoregion. I mean, it's just a fascinating landscape for so many reasons, and I guess maybe because it's a karst hydrology, but because it's a karst hydrology, there are these beautiful perennial flowing, cool streams in a semi-arid environment. So when you think about that, that just doesn't happen very much. That's why people love the Edwards Plateau so much in the hill country. If you are even a little bit attuned to land management, as you drive across the Edwards Plateau, you can have a pretty good idea of how this landscape has been managed. And the other thing that for me is really gratifying and encouraging is just how resilient this landscape is. So it's really a special place, and I've spent on and off the last 25 years trying to understand what are the interactions between vegetation and the water cycle. So that's my story. That's what I'm going to tell you today. And I'll do that, but just promise me you don't call the university president afterwards, which has happened after some of my presentations, but hopefully those days are over with. So, as I mentioned, this phenomena of woody plant encroachment, it's a global phenomena. It's happening in rangelands all over the world, and generally started about 200 years ago, 150 years ago, certainly associated with colonization by the Europeans. When people often think about the Great Plains, they think about these wide open grasslands. And what I do with students sometimes is I say, just Google the Great Plains and look at images. You could try that today. And I can almost promise you that the images that will come up are going to be wide open grasslands. People think about grasslands. But what is the reality? The reality now, especially in the southern Great Plains, is that grasslands have largely disappeared. I'm exaggerating just a bit. Sure, we can find some grasslands somewhere. But by and large, Texas and the southern Great Plains have converted from mainly grasslands to woodlands. And this has been my sort of scientific mission, is really trying to understand what's the implications of this incredible land cover change to the water cycle. So let's just do a quick windshield tour of Texas. We got the South Texas shrublands. These at one point were mostly grasslands. They were, of course, the first to be inhabited by the Europeans. So that the shift from grasslands to shrublands happened sooner. The West Texas, Mike mentioned that he loves creosote bush. I don't love creosote bush as much, but I mean, it is an interesting plant. But we've lost most of our desert grasslands during this time. The rolling plains at one time were grasslands. Now they're largely mesquite savannas. And of course, the Edwards Plateau, looking at historical accounts, yes, there has been cedar and other trees here forever, but there definitely were a lot more grasslands in the Edwards Plateau than there have been in the past. So we've probably spent $4 billion in Texas in the last 40 years throughout my career in this war on shrubs. And we really have not been very effective at all. But this is, there's no going back. So we're managing savannas and woodlands, and I'm not hopeful that we're going to actually go back to grasslands. That would be very difficult. Anyway, the process is pretty much played out here, but what is worrisome to many people that care about plant communities in the Great Plains is that it's still continuing as you move north. The cross timbers and post oak savanna, a little more advanced, but still increasing woody plants. The rolling plains in Oklahoma actively being converted from grasslands to eastern cedar. And then even the remaining part of the tallgrass prairie, much of that tallgrass prairie is being converted to woodlands. And we can go even farther north into Nebraska and South Dakota. And so this phenomena is happening right now. And so there's a lot of concern. In the early stages, is there something that we can do to keep that from happening? But in any case, here in Texas, the reality is that we are in a savanna and woodland landscape. So Matt emphasized change. And I was afraid Matt was going to steal my thunder, but he didn't go in too much detail, but really to really understand and appreciate what's happening in the Edwards Plateau, we need to appreciate what happened beginning around 1870, maybe a little bit sooner. But when you think about it, what was going on? The Civil War had ended. We had subdued the Native Americans. Most importantly, the buffalo were wiped out. There was technology change, windmills, railroads, and also importantly, lots of money in Europe to invest in this wide open landscape. And as Matt pointed out, very, very, very quickly, livestock just poured into Texas, the southern Great Plains, and farther west. And this was just a transformational change. It's almost unimaginable how many animals were here in this very, very, very short period of time. The best that we can guess is that maybe stocking rates were 100 times what they are right now. So very, very quickly, this landscape went from a prairie system to really a very, very degraded landscape. So if you don't, so in order for grasslands to thrive and exist, they have to have disturbance. And primarily fire, regular fire is critically important. And then also, maybe not as recognized by many people as being important, is a rich grazing gield, but importantly that it needs to have browsers in there. So with this disruption, we disrupted these disturbances that maintain the grasslands, and that set in motion this change that we've experienced. Now, I'm going to show you what I think are really a remarkable set of paired photographs. And I would challenge anybody to try to find a photograph of the Edwards Plateau in post-1960, 1940, that does not look like this. I have not seen one. The Edwards Plateau was basically an extremely overgrazed, almost equivalent to a parking lot. So that is what it was like probably from 1890 to certainly 1960. And so this is important to keep in mind when I talk about changes in river flow that have happened. I also said the Edwards Plateau is an amazing, resilient landscape. This first set of photographs are from the Sonora Research Station, the Texas A&M Research Station. In this particular spot has been well managed, incorporating fire, appropriate grazing management. So you can see that the Edwards Plateau is quite responsive to good management. But the second slide, this is the Pumpkin Cave here in the Edwards Plateau. Probably not as well managed, but even in this site, there has been a really dramatic change in vegetation cover. So my story, I'm going to get right to the punchline here. My story is that this conversion to woody plants has actually been a good thing in terms of health and recharge in terms of the Edwards Plateau. Anyway, we can kind of dwell on that for a moment and just kind of think about the implications of this dramatic change. So my sort of cartoon version of what's happened in the Edwards Plateau, pre-1850, more or less a pristine prairie, open savanna. Very, very quickly, this reverted to extremely degraded landscape. And this continued probably until about 1965. By and large, the Edwards Plateau is well managed now. There's certainly still some overgrazing. But I would say heavy grazing probably persisted into the 1960s and 70s. But now we have, in most parts of the Edwards Plateau, lots of vegetation cover, but a lot more trees than what we had in the past. Okay, so let's talk about the ecohydrology of the Edwards Plateau. And so the question that has fascinated me throughout my stint here in Texas has been, how does vegetation influence the water cycle on the Edwards Plateau? And we can see all kinds of different land cover conditions. As I said, there's still, regrettably, too much area in the Edwards Plateau that is overgrazed. And a point that I would make, if you're interested in enhancing recharge, the first order thing that you can do is appropriate management in terms of grazing management. But, you have other conditions where you basically 100% cedar cover. Let me be clear, I am not arguing that we want to manage the Edwards Plateau where it looks like that. There are many good reasons to actively do brush management, so I'm not arguing that we want this Edwards Plateau to turn into a cedar thicket. So that's what the issues that I've been thinking about and trying to resolve. And we sort of asked the same question, which is how does vegetation influence the water budget, but using a whole variety of techniques in the field, all the way from point measurements to tree measurements, to small catchment measurements, doing rainfall simulation, and then borrowing from work from people like Michael and others who do micrometeorological surveys, and just really trying to put that together and come up with what we think is a coherent explanation for how vegetation influences the water cycle. So I'll be sharing some insights from these different kinds of studies. So what have we learned? Well, number one, I don't think this is very common. I've crawled in plenty of caves, not as many as you, Marcus, and others, and I've seen lots of tree roots in caves accessing pools of water and whatnot. But I don't really think that this is very common, and I think that maybe even now, but in the past certainly, many people had the idea that the trees are these really, really, really deep-rooted, and they're directly accessing groundwater. So why do I say I don't think it's very common? Well, because I've looked at a lot of road cuts, and I've looked at a lot of places where people are installing pipes across the Edwards Plateau. And we've put in a lot of trenches, probably about 100 trenches. I had the pleasure of working with Larry Wilding. He is unfortunately now deceased, but he was just like really a premier soil geomorphologist from Texas A&M University. So we've put in a lot of trenches, and what do we see? We see that the cedar are mostly shallow rooted, and so they're not directly accessing groundwater. So that's one thing that we've learned. Number two, so when I came to Texas A&M in 2000, and really kind of a common perception was that, well, if we just remove the cedar, water is going to appear. We can make the streams flow just removing the cedar. I was fortunate to get involved into a study around Annandale, and this is really quite a rigorous watershed study. 9 small watersheds were established. We observed runoff for 3 years, and then after 3 years, 6 of those watersheds were cleared. And really the bottom line from that observation was that it really made no difference in terms of surface flow. So that's one thing I'm quite confident of, and this has been validated by the USGS. The USGS has done some catchment work at the Honey Creek. I know Marcos was involved in that. Maybe you even built that weir. I'm not sure. Or flume weir. So we're pretty confident that just removing cedar is not going to work miracles in terms of surface flow. Well, what about spring flow? Oh, wait, before we get into that, another set of studies that were funded by the EAA that were really fun to do and very interesting was, well, what if we could just go into caves and instrument the drips and then do rainfall simulation on top of the surface and see what happens? So we were able to do that, and that was really a lot of fun and very insightful. I was asking Michael about conduit flow versus diffuse flow. And by doing that, we were able to directly measure conduit flow. And what did we see? We see that conduit flow happens immediately, and that a lot of the water that's put on in some places moves very fast through this rock matrix. But importantly, what we also found is that we removed all of the trees and did the experiment again, and basically there was no change. That conduit flow was still important, but we did not get this miraculous increase in conduit flow after doing that. So removing shrubs does not necessarily increase rapid recharge. And my own bias is I think the rapid recharge is by far the most important way that the aquifer is recharged. Okay, well, what about spring flow? And I know this is kind of embedded culturally into Texans, especially people in the hill country and the Edwards Plateau, that springs are drying up. And they certainly are, but cedar has been blamed for the springs drying up. And so what we've tried to do is tease out what is the effect of overpumping, and then what is the effect of cedar. But surprisingly, even though it's really widely accepted that if you remove the trees, that you're going to get increased spring flow, there's been actually one study that has looked at that. And that was the study that I'm citing right here with my PhD student, Yun Wang. So there's not really strong evidence that removing cedar is going to really hugely increase spring flow. What we found is that spring flow did increase, but not by a huge amount, by about 50 millimeters a year. So we were, just kind of thinking, well, is this universal? Is this real? But we were gratified that, there have been, Mike mentioned these micrometeorological studies, and these are really insightful. The first one that I know of was done in 1995 by Bill Dugas. And then the USGS at Honey Creek also did some of these micrometeorological studies. And just to remind you guys and to repeat what Michael said, is that this is a way of directly measuring evapotranspiration, and then we can kind of back out. If we know rainfall and evapotranspiration, we can make a good guess at recharge. Well, these micrometeorological studies were indicating that open grasslands compared to woodlands, that yes, indeed, there was or is about 50 millimeters more evapotranspiration where you have trees versus where you have grasslands. So that is a difference, and it's an important difference, but something that I just wasn't comfortable with is that this is a difference that is accumulating daily and just an addition of hundredths of a millimeter difference. So tiny, 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 tiny differences every day. But you add that up, and at the end of the year, you get 50 millimeters, and that's a lot of water over a year. So another set of experiments that was really insightful and fun to do was large-scale rainfall simulation studies. And so we were able to sprinkle rainfall on a hill slope about half the size of this room. Of course, the advantage of that is that then you could create a rainstorm. You're there, you're measuring everything. And we had the idea, well, let's put in trenches at the base of these hill slopes, and let's just see if interflow, this is what we call water that flows laterally through the rock, let's just see if that's important. And I didn't show this photograph. I probably should have. After we did our first rainfall simulation, this trench was halfway full of water. So the answer to our question was, yes, interflow is extremely important in this landscape, and also it is very, very dynamic. And it was a large part of the water that we put on actually left that site, but moving laterally. So, shallow subsurface flow, interflow, this is really an important part of runoff generation. And understanding runoff generation is important for a lot of reasons, but for this question of recharge, it's important because we want to try to figure out how is water moving across this landscape and how does water ultimately get into the aquifer. And I think in many places, this shallow subsurface flow is an important way. But we saw interflow, we saw much more interflow when we did the simulations above trees than we saw in areas where there were no trees. So this is very, very interesting. This is where we're starting to think, wow, maybe the trees are actually facilitating subsurface flow in this landscape. And I just add again, after removing the trees, we did not see any difference in subsurface flow. So we don't magically increase subsurface flow after removing the trees. So I know that when people think about, well, how cedar is affecting the water budget, they go, well, it's just intercepting all the water. The cedar is capturing all the water. Well, that's exactly right. It is capturing a lot of the water, but for only certain kinds of rain events. So this was kind of really a neat set of studies that was put in by Keith Owens. Keith was here about 15 years ago, worked at the experiment station at Uvalde, where he was able to continuously monitor. So for those of you who don't know what interception is, that's just the amount of water that plants capture, and that water never makes it to the ground, and it gets evaporated up. Well, if you look at the amount of interception, so interception is this curved line that goes from 100 to 140. If you look at, for the very small rainfall events, like the ones that we're experiencing right now or yesterday, maybe 100% of that water is intercepted by juniper canopy. But when we think about what kind of events recharge the Edwards Aquifer, well, it's the rainfall events that are 6 inches, 10 inches, 15 inches, 20 inches. For those kinds of rainfall events, interception is not important. So that's kind of a nuance, but it's an important nuance to understand. So interception by juniper, just to be plain, does not decrease groundwater recharge. Now, it has lots of other ecological and important influences, but not groundwater recharge. So that's point number 9. So are you confused? Well, you could say it's kind of all over the map. On 2008, I was too, and I was really trying to figure out, what's my story? We say that cutting juniper increases spring flow, but it doesn't increase surface flow, but there's this interception component. And Michael was talking about the importance of scaling up. And we're so fortunate. Let me back off. So back to my confusion. Confused, hence my question about diffuse recharge and conduit recharge. And kind of imagine this as a two-water world paradox. We've got good evidence that the trees are using more water than the grassland is. So that's kind of on the slow water side. So the ET towers, yeah, there's a difference, but it's like 7/100ths of a millimeter a day. Do you know how small? Think about how small 7/100ths of a millimeter is. That's really, really, really tiny. But you accumulate it. So that's why I call it slow water. But there's no doubt that recharge in the Edwards Aquifer is dominated by fast water, where recharge happens really fast. This is what's the famous well here, J17. So shortly after I arrived at Texas A&M, there was this huge rainfall event, anywhere from 20 to 40 millimeters. Those of you who are 20 to 40 inches, any of you who are my age or thereabouts probably remember that. So J17 went from 650 feet to 690 feet in less than a week. So that's what I call fast recharge. So the system operates under different time scales. So anyway, trying to reconcile that has really been something I've been puzzling over, and I think we're getting closer with help from Michael and his group, and also some measurements that we're making. Okay, now the scaling up. This is where things start clarifying for me a little bit. We can be grateful to the long-term streamflow data that the USGS has been collecting, some cases since 1915. And these data have been incredibly valuable for helping to kind of clarify how has the landscape hydrology responded to this incredible vegetation change that I described earlier. So we were able to look at historical stream flow in 4 different watersheds across the Edwards Plateau. three different, no, Frio, the Nueces, Llano, and then Guadalupe. So the upper graph there is just a composite of rainfall from 1915 to 2010, and the story there is that, you know, basically for that record, rainfall has not changed on average across the plateau. But what we did with this streamflow record, and so for those of you who are not hydrologists, which is probably most of this room, please bear with me. What you can do with these records is that you can do what we call a base flow separation, that you can separate, okay, how much of the stream flow is these flood events, and then how much of the stream flow is what we call base flow. And base flow is really what is provided by springs. And so that's the water that's coming between these big flood events. So we did that. And this, I think, is a remarkable graph. And it really communicates one of the main messages here. So if we look at, and these lines are 10-year moving averages. So each point represents 5 years previous and 5 years back average, just kind of so you can smooth things out. And the important line to look at is the red line, and that is base flow, and I'm using that as a proxy for spring flow. Now remember, the common paradigm, both in the scientific community and in the public, is that springs have disappeared in the Edwards Plateau because, well, implicitly because cedar have come in. And I was sort of open to that. But this just blew us away. But what is showing is that you can see in base flow dips in the 1950s. That's the historical drought of record. But then something remarkable happens beginning around after the drought, but after 1965, you can see that base flow continues to increase. And if you think about these other photographs that I showed you before, my kind of working model about how the landscape changed, it's at this point that woody plants, the plateau, is starting to become revegetated. And remarkably, base flow from 1970 to 2008 was twice as high as it was before the drought. So not only are we saying that springs did not disappear, but spring flow has actually increased during this time. So if you want to figure out, if you want a way of really getting people hot under the collars, you make a presentation like this in 2010 when this wasn't really widely accepted. But it seems like people are kind of coming around to what we're saying. So how do we make sense of that? Well, it's really not hard to make sense of it, in my opinion. It's sort of watershed management 101. That previous record that we saw was a very, very degraded landscape, and now what's happened is we have a much more vegetated landscape that's capable of absorbing rainfall when it comes, and then ultimately recharging the aquifer. And so our explanation for this is that, well, trees must be increasing soil infiltrability. Another way of saying is that these trees have actually had a role in soil restoration. And that makes sense. Anybody that's walked through a cedar forest, you see a tremendous amount of duff that's been added by these trees. So these trees are continually adding organic matter. This is the same thing you do in your garden. So we had pretty good evidence of some of our rainfall simulation studies. You know, when we did the large-scale rainfall simulation under tree canopies, we could not make it run off. We could not put enough water on there to make water run off. So you had extremely high infiltration. Well, by 2010, I think I pissed everybody off so much, I thought, you know, I'm just going to kind of back off. I took a sabbatical in Ecuador and Brazil and started working other places. But then we got interested again in terms of the Edwards Plateau, and things haven't been resolved to our satisfaction. A remarkable PhD student came to my lab, Pedro Leite, and Pedro did some really nice experiments looking at soil infiltration under juniper using more small plot measurements. But he also did something very interesting. He measured infiltration under trees all the way from very, very tiny trees to much larger trees. So I told you that I approach this with lots of humility. Usually before a field study, I make a bold prediction, and usually I'm wrong with my prediction. My prediction was that we wouldn't see any kind of effect until the trees got a lot older. But even for what this graph is basically showing, you can take my word for it, is that infiltration is much higher under the trees than in what we call the inner canopy. But remarkably, even for a tree that was 3 years old, infiltration was about 5 times higher than what it was in the inner canopy. So this change starts happening very soon after the trees are established. Now here's something. My talk was implications for conservation and management, and this is maybe one of the more important points that I have, is that there is a legacy effect of the trees influencing soil health that if appropriately managed, these good qualities in terms of infiltrability can remain even after the tree is removed. And so we did these similar experiments, but we did it on trees that had been dead for over 10 years. So what that means is that, so one of the things I'm saying is that trees have actively worked to accomplish soil restoration across this very, very degraded landscape. And even after removing the trees, if you don't take a bulldozer across there or whatnot, that there are ways of probably restoring the landscape, removing the cedar, and still maintaining the soil health. Okay, so we're continuing, and this is going to intersect a little bit what Michael was talking about, but we're very, very interested in trying to document this relationship between trees and soil health. Very, very interested in rock water. We're also working with Daniela and people at UT. I'll share some of those results a little bit. But also remarkably, Pedro has demonstrated that not only are the trees increasing soil infiltrability, for those of you who are geologists or geochemists, you might find this interesting, they are accelerating the amount of rock weathering. So just very, very quickly, this is work that's in review in Water Resources Research, trying to get at questions that Michael posed about rock water. And what Pedro did was along a hill slope or cadena, he put in these deep neutron probes where we can measure soil water and rock water along a catena, and just sort of just to get to the gist, similar to what Michael was saying, is that Pedro has determined that the trees are using rock water, and they use it during drought, and they use it during very dry periods. So about maybe, some years, maybe 100 millimeters a year. So this is, I'll make that point in a bit. All right, so this is the study looking at the rock weathering. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but so I'll just kind of end my talk in terms of what's my current thinking. Where are we at? Okay, this two-water world paradox, to some extent, I'm thinking that we've resolved it, or some of it, that the reason that the ET tower work is showing that under woodlands you get slightly more water use than grasslands, where this extra water is coming from, I think is in the rock matrix. But what I have not resolved, and which I'm very interested in continuing discussions with Michael and others, is this water in the rock matrix, and Michael, I think, was arguing that it is it important in terms of groundwater recharge? And so that's a question that we need to resolve. So in other words, by the nature of the fact that trees are indeed using more rock water, does that have implications for groundwater recharge? And I don't have an answer to that. All right, so main takeaway. Well, takeaway number one, removing juniper is not going to have a magic bullet effect on groundwater recharge. And for reasons that sort of Michael described, but even more importantly, I think that we're coming to, at least some of us are recognizing, not just juniper, but woody plants, that they have been almost accidentally a fantastic mechanism for restoration of the Edwards Plateau. And getting back to the question that Paul posed is that how can we manage this landscape so that we can enhance recharge? Well, this is kind of a good news story. This has happened without us really intentionally trying to do it, that there has been a lot of recovery, I think, in groundwater recharge. But another important takeaway, woody plant encroachment has facilitated soil restoration. And to be clear, I'm not arguing, okay, cedar breaks are great, leave them in, don't touch them, whatnot. Certainly, yeah, we need to manage these landscapes, but potentially, and I think this is maybe a great research effort, how can we manage these landscapes? How can we do brush control and maintain the soil health that has been improved as a result of the woody plants? So this is really kind of the challenge, either whether we're going from degraded, overgrazed rangelands, or we're going from a cedar break. You know, how can we do that in a way that maintains soil health? I just want to make sure that people understand what I am saying. I'm not saying that trees have no influence on groundwater recharge, and I'm not saying that even managing vegetation has no influence on groundwater recharge. I'm just saying that in the Edwards Plateau. This is an important statement. The hydrologic response of woody plant encroachment is mediated by climate and geology. So it's going to be really dependent on what landscape that you're working in. And we've tried to, so I've worked in most of these ecoregions in Texas, and the hydrologic response to this vegetation change is different. Edwards Plateau, we think groundwater recharge is increased. Mesquite savannas in the rolling plains, we actually think that woody plants have resulted in dramatically decreased stream flow. And in more humid areas, yes, trees are definitely getting water, to your point that you asked about whether trees use more water than grasses. Trees are definitely using more water than grasses, and there are opportunities. Well, this is a paper we put together trying to come up with a framework that describes these potentially disparate results. If you're interested in that explanation, I would refer you to this work. But I don't want you to leave, again, thinking that I'm saying there's no connection. In fact, an area that I'm really excited about now is working in the Post Oak Savanna. Post Oak Savanna aligns almost exactly with the recharge area of the Carrizo Wilcox. And, drum roll, if you want a landscape that's just really perfect for manipulating vegetation to increase groundwater recharge, you cannot get a more perfect landscape than the Post Oak Savanna. There's enough rainfall. Importantly, there's a very, very, very deep sandy geology, and the trees are accessing deeper water that grasses cannot access. And then also, if anybody is from that region, you'll see that it's really one screwed up landscape in terms of what's happened in terms of land management and land use. But if the land is just let go, it basically becomes what we call a thicketized woodland. And to just a final point, we're starting to do quite a bit of work here in this landscape, and we've shown really dramatic differences in recharge in an area where you have these thicketized woodlands versus grasslands. And I'm talking like the difference between 100 millimeters of recharge under grasslands and 0 recharge under these thicketized woodlands. So I think that this would be one landscape that there are real opportunities for doing land management, for increasing recharge in a really important regional aquifer. Okay, that's my story. And a final note, this work, I'm representing it, but I'm representing work that's been done by lots and lots of very, very dedicated early career professionals. And then, of course, we're grateful for support from funding agencies, including the Edwards Aquifer Authority. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So.